Diana O'Neill woke up to the muffled hum of the suburbs. Somewhere on the neighboring street, a lawnmower was buzzing, a dog was barking in the distance, and the morning breeze gently rustled the curtains by the open window. She lingered for a moment, gazing at the narrow strips of light falling on the edge of the bed. Just a slight turn of the head, and she could see her husband Mark's profile. He sleeps so quietly that time in the room seems to stand still. In moments like these, Diana was torn by conflicting feelings. On one hand, there was the comfort and safety of their large home in a typical American suburb. On the other, a sense that this life was slowly getting stuck in one note. The clock on the bedside table showed 6:10 a.m., the exact time she had been waking up for the past 15 years. When their son Callum was little, early mornings made sense. She had to prepare breakfast, find a missing shoe, and see the child off to the school bus. Now Callum was 20, studying in college and mostly hanging out with friends. But Diana's habit of rising at dawn and caring for everyone but herself hadn't gone away. Downstairs in the living room, she saw the familiar interior, a spacious gray sofa, photos on the mantelpiece, one of them showing a happy little Callum with a proud Mark beside him. Many would say this family embodied the American dream, and perhaps it did. But somewhere deep inside, Diana felt an increasingly strong emptiness. She mechanically turned on the coffee maker, watching as streams of hot coffee filled the kitchen with a rich aroma. Soon Mark would come down. With a tired smile, he would take a coffee mug, say a quick "thank you, dear," and sit down to check his work emails on his laptop. Their silent morning ritual was a definition of comfort and stability. And yet, Diana thought, something in this familiar routine had long since faded. As the coffee brewed, she heard footsteps upstairs. Soon Callum entered the kitchen, tall in a baggy hoodie, his eyes still sleepy. He exuded that youthful energy that once pulsed within Diana herself. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled, yawning. "We have practice today." "Will you be back for dinner?" she asked, adding a bit of milk to her coffee. "Maybe not," he shrugged. "Planning to meet up with Alex. We want to grab a bite at the new diner." Alex. The name was familiar. He was one of those friends who was a bit older than the others. At the last party, he surprised Diana. Unlike Callum's rowdy friends, Alex quietly offered to help clean up, and his polite manner stood out. However, she didn't give it much thought at the time. "All right," she said with a distracted smile. "Let me know if your plans change." Callum nodded and, kissing her on the cheek, headed out the door, off for his morning run. Now the kitchen was almost silent. A cool breeze wafted in through the slightly open window, and the table clock ticked steadily, as if counting the seconds of a life that could not be regained. Perhaps many would find this atmosphere soothing, but for Diana, the silence lately seemed too perfect, like the smooth surface of water hiding something beneath. She lingered over the family photos. In one, Callum was hugging Mark. They had just returned from fishing, both wet and laughing, as if capturing a personal triumph. Gazing at this photo, Diana felt a faint longing for the old times when everything was spontaneous and alive. Will I be doomed to this steady but cooling routine forever? She wondered. Before she could delve deeper into her memories, the aroma of coffee filled the room more intensely. Mark would be down soon. As always, she would prepare a mug for him. He would say his usual words, and they would face the new day, repeating yesterday's routine. Inside, Diana understood that there were no serious problems in their life. No financial difficulties, no major arguments, just no emotional closeness either. That fire which once made her sing around the house had gone out. She decided to distract herself, quickly washed her mug, wiped her hands on a towel, and looked out the window. The morning sun was already bathing the lawn in soft gold. In the distance, someone rode by on a bicycle. On the horizon, a dog barked loudly but soon fell silent. Everything seemed so perfect. A typical American suburb where every morning was predictably the same. Soon Mark appeared in the kitchen, disheveled hair, a half-hearted smile. He took the mug from her and took a satisfying sip. "Thanks, Di," he said absently, already glancing at his laptop screen on the dining table. At that moment, Diana caught herself thinking that she used to find joy in caring for her loved one, but now she struggled to find satisfaction in it. She responded with a light smile, but inside she felt that something was inevitably changing. Maybe she didn't know how life would turn in the coming days, but deep inside, her heart quietly vibrated with the anticipation of new events. Under the clink of the spoon in the cup and the steady hum of the air conditioner, Diana took a sip of coffee. The calendar on the fridge reminded her of the to-do list. Buy groceries, go to the dry cleaners, check when Callum would return. Everything followed the usual schedule, but as soon as she closed her eyes, it was as if a cool breeze touched her thoughts. She had no idea that this peaceful routine would soon be disrupted by the first spark of new passion. Something barely noticeable had already begun to grow within her, like a timid sprout amidst dry, stagnant soil. And this sprout demanded light, water, and perhaps a decision that would overturn her entire previous way of life. For now, Diana sighed, pretended she felt nothing, and went about her usual chores, unaware that not everything would remain ordinary. In the backyard, it was noisy and hot. The heat of the grill, the smell of meat sizzling on the grates, laughter and conversations of young voices all around. Diana walked across the wooden deck by the pool, balancing a tray of refreshing drinks, while Callum's friends laughed and joked, sitting at the pool's edge. From the outside, it looked like a classic American weekend party, noisy, carefree, with loud music and the fading of heartache somewhere far beyond the gates of the house. But inside, Diana did not feel the lightness that reigned around her. In essence, she was routinely serving the guests, carrying plates of snacks, changing drinks, making sure everyone had enough towels. Once, she enjoyed organizing family barbecues and meeting with friends and relatives. Now, feeling like she was running back and forth between the kitchen and the pool with endless errands, she realized that something had changed. The feeling that she had been living for others for a long time, while she herself seemed to be in the shadows, grew stronger. At that moment, she noticed Alex Holt, Callum's friend, approaching her. Tall, slightly stooped, he moved slowly, overtaking a group of giggling girls who splashed into the water. His ash-blonde hair was slightly tousled, his shirt unbuttoned, revealing a light t-shirt underneath. Despite this, there was a calm confidence in Alex's gaze that set him apart from his noisy peers. "Mrs. O'Neill, can I help you?" he asked quietly, pointing to the plates Diana was trying to hold on the tray. Yes, thank you," she replied, embarrassed, and handed him one of the heavy bowls of sliced fruit. They approached the long table, which was already almost full of new snacks. Diana set down the tray, averting her gaze from Alex, trying not to notice how close he leaned in to help arrange the plates. But her heart tightened uncomfortably and pleasantly at the same time. She faintly perceived his cologne, and it aroused a strange excitement in her. "Thank you for your help," she said softly, looking around the bustling yard. "No problem," he replied, lingering with his gaze on her. For a moment, his smile softened. "I noticed you're handling everything alone here. Maybe you should take a break?" His words seemed simple and friendly, but they held an unfamiliar care for her. For a second, she looked at him in confusion, not used to being asked what she needed instead of giving. But now someone was offering her a moment of rest. Maybe later," she replied, trying to keep a neutral tone. "You guys have fun. Don't worry about me." However, as she walked away, she caught a glimpse of him still watching her from the corner of her eye. He wasn't rushing back to the group. He stood under the shade of an umbrella near the lounge chairs and seemed to be stealthily observing her. There was nothing provocative or bold in his gaze, just attentiveness, rare for a young man who could simply enjoy the party with his peers. Soon Callum emerged from the water, dripping wet, and climbed onto the pool's edge. He noticed where Alex was looking, and for a moment, his face tensed. Diana saw this brief change. Her son clearly noticed that his friend was looking at his mother longer than usual. But Callum quickly looked away, pretending nothing had happened. A slight shadow of jealousy or bewilderment remained in his eyes. Diana felt embarrassed. "Maybe I'm just imagining things," she scolded herself mentally. "It's just a polite young man offering help, and I'm already feeling this strange excitement." And yet a faint echo in her soul whispered that something special was happening between them. A little later, when another batch of hot dogs was ready, Diana stepped aside to take a break near a small garden bed. Her gaze was distant as she watched a dragonfly hover over the flowers. But the sound of footsteps behind her revealed someone's approach. Taking a break after all? Alex asked softly. Yes, she replied, turning around. I decided I needed a moment, even if it's just 5 minutes. He nodded, leaning against a low stone wall. The air was hot, and the scent of fresh greenery wafted from the damp grass. A few meters away, the sound of splashing water and the distant rhythm of music from a portable speaker filled the air. I rarely go to parties like this, Alex suddenly confessed, running a hand through his hair. I prefer something quieter, just the two of us, or a small group. Diana noticed how carefully he chose his words, trying not to look her directly in the eyes, and realized that, despite his youth, there was a depth in his stories that was uncharacteristic of the noisy youth gathered around the pool. She tried to switch the topic to something neutral, asking about his hobbies, how he met Callum. She learned that Alex had transferred from another college and traveled a lot around the country with his parents as a child. His voice was calm and measured, and in his stories, she sensed a depth not typical of the boisterous youth around the pool. And at some point, Diana caught herself enjoying listening to him. She enjoyed that he asked questions and genuinely waited for answers. She enjoyed that there was no perfunctory indifference in his gaze. And in this short conversation, under the sun and the shouts of the resting, she noticed how a faint spark ignited within her, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. Suddenly, Callum walked by, and one of his friends rushed over, urging him to return to the pool. Callum glanced at them briefly, that same tense expression flashing across his face, before quickly leading his friend away. Diana felt a wave of embarrassment. She realized how ridiculous their 5-minute conversations with a promising young man might look, who seemed to be the only one here to notice her inner fatigue. But she couldn't bring herself to step away. Something in his presence gave her a sense of being seen, and she couldn't easily give that up. When Alex finally stepped away, smiling at her in farewell, Diana remained by the garden bed with a racing heart. She clearly understood that nothing had happened, and yet everything had changed. From this thought, she felt both hot and cold. For now, she sighed, pretended she felt nothing, and joined the circle of guests. Amid the boisterous laughter and splashing water, she furtively searched for Alex with her gaze but tried not to show it. The barbecue continued, the noise grew louder, the sun beat down harder. No one seemed to notice that the hostess was experiencing an emotional storm inside, but someone did notice. Callum occasionally cast suspicious glances in her direction. Diana tried to hide her turmoil from her son, stubbornly maintaining the image of a loving and calm mother, just entertaining friends. She didn't know then that everything happening was just the beginning of a delicate, dangerous game. No matter how hard she tried to stay within the bounds of propriety and inner morality, a mechanism had been set in motion that could soon rob her of her peace, or perhaps it would return her long-forgotten life. And as the sun began to set, the barbecue reached its climax. Someone turned up the music, someone laughed, hugging for a group photo. Diana was one step away from joining the fun and smiling as if nothing troubled her soul. But in reality, her heart was pounding so hard she could almost hear the blood pulsing in her temples. Despite herself, she kept thinking about Alex Holt, his calm speech, his elusive kindness. Against the backdrop of summer colors and the laughter of her son's friends, Diana felt that something in her world had shifted and would never return to its place. And perhaps this was just the beginning of a path from which there was no turning back. The day after the noisy party and the lingering aftertaste of the evening, Diana woke up to a sky as gloomy as her mood. The weather seemed to demand silence. Usually, Saturday mornings were filled with familiar sounds. Mark moving around the house, getting ready for fishing or shopping, and Callum choosing what to wear before meeting friends. But today, looking down the hallway, Diana saw only half-closed doors. Mark had gone to work, a rare but urgent call, and Callum had left with friends to ride motorcycles. The house was filled with an unfamiliar emptiness. Even the central air conditioner seemed to hum more quietly. Diana went downstairs to the living room, pausing for a moment by the window to inhale the light morning air. In her soul there was a tumult. Part of her rejoiced at the opportunity to be alone, while another part felt a nervous readiness for something she couldn't quite articulate. She made herself some coffee and sank onto the sofa, leaning her head back. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of her conversation with Alex, his unusual politeness and attentiveness. She remembered the moment by the garden bed when they talked about trivial things, and yet she felt that long-forgotten sensation of being seen and heard. She silently exhaled. "This is ridiculous," she told herself. "He's just a friend of my son. I'm acting like a schoolgirl with a crush." In the midst of these thoughts, the silence was broken by the sound of the doorbell. Diana started, set down her mug, and went to answer it. "Hi. Hope it's not too early," Alex said, a bit embarrassed, holding a toolbox in his hands. "Callum said you have a broken cabinet in the laundry room. I promised to help." Diana looked at him in surprise. "Yes, there's a sticking door, but Callum didn't mention you were coming." Alex shrugged. "I figured he forgot, but I remembered that I promised. Besides, I was in the neighborhood anyway." Diana felt a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. On one hand, she felt awkward. Was this help too personal? On the other, she genuinely needed someone to fix that stubborn cabinet. "Come in," she said, trying to sound calm. They walked down the narrow hallway to the laundry room. In the dim light of the room, Alex began to sort through his tools, while Diana stood slightly to the side, watching as he carefully opened the cabinet door and inspected the mechanism. Every movement seemed to echo loudly in the silence that filled the room. "Looks like the hinge is broken here," Alex said, slightly straining his arm to lift the door. "We need to replace the fastener, or at least tighten the screws." Diana nodded, crouching down next to him to examine the problem. For a moment, their shoulders brushed, and she felt a flush of heat in her cheeks. In the silence, every rustle of the tools seemed louder, and between them hung an unspoken tension. "Sorry to bother you on your weekend," she said softly, trying to ease the atmosphere. "It's okay, I'm actually glad to help," Alex replied, glancing at her briefly. In his gaze, there was a care that was unusual for someone who had simply come to tighten some screws. As he worked, Diana couldn't help but notice the features of his face. Sharp cheekbones, soft lips, a slightly mischievous arch of his eyebrows when something didn't go right the first time. And she caught herself feeling a wave of tender affection that she couldn't explain. When the fastener was finally replaced and the cabinet door closed smoothly, Alex stood up, brushing off his hands and nodding satisfactorily. "All fixed. You can check it out." Diana reached for the door, running her hand over it. Indeed, no more squeaking or sticking. "Thank you," she said softly, realizing she had spoken quieter than intended. "I don't know how to repay you." Alex shrugged. "I could use a cup of tea if that's not too much trouble." Diana hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course. Come to the kitchen." The kitchen greeted them with the same quiet half-light as always. But now the silence seemed to hold an unspoken approval. Diana put the kettle on and took out cups from the cabinet. Inside, she felt a whirlwind of anxiety. Was offering tea to a young man who had come to help too homely? But she couldn't deny the feeling that this conversation was important in a way that far outweighed any ordinary chat. "Have you been friends with Callum for long?" she asked, pouring the boiling water. "We met last semester. He always talks about his family, how his dad is strict, but his mom—" Alex paused. "He speaks about you with warmth." Diana felt herself smiling. "I hope it's all good things," she said, trying to hide her embarrassment. But Alex continued seriously. "You know, Callum admires you in a way. He says you always support people, even when you're tired yourself." She lowered her eyes to her cup, trying to hide her surge of emotions. In her mind, she briefly wondered, "My son talks about me? And with such pride?" At that moment, she caught Alex's gaze. He was looking at her as if he wanted to say something important, but was hesitating. The air was filled with the vibration of unspoken words, about the dullness of her marriage, the feeling of loneliness in her own home, the realization that she had been living for others and forgetting about herself. "Are you okay?" Alex asked softly, and she felt a jolt. "I guess so," she replied, feeling a lump in her throat. "It's just that sometimes living for others becomes a habit, and you forget about yourself." She was surprised at her own words. She hadn't intended to reveal so much. But Alex listened as if every word she said was important. In his gaze, there was understanding and sympathy. "I get it," he said quietly. "It's important to find time for yourself, even when it feels like you don't have the right to take a break." His words sounded simple but profound, and in that brief moment, Diana felt something shift inside her, as if someone had gently drawn back a curtain, letting light into the stale room of her soul. In the house, it was still quiet, but now the silence no longer frightened her. Instead, it created a cozy space where two people could pause and look at each other a little deeper than the familiar boundaries of mother of a friend and friend of a son allowed. And although nothing overtly inappropriate was said in their conversation, the energy between them was charged. As they finished their tea, Diana felt a pang of regret that he had to leave so soon. But she said, "Thank you for fixing the cabinet. I owe Callum an explanation. He completely forgot." They both laughed, trying to lighten the mood with a smile, even though the unspoken words hung heavily between them. Alex shook his head, glanced briefly around the house, and stepped out the door. When the door closed behind him, Diana stood alone in the empty hallway, feeling a sense of a new chapter unfolding in her life. In the quiet house, she felt a mix of excitement and fear. Her heart was telling her that she was on the brink of something new, something that could change everything. She looked at the second untouched cup of tea on the table. On the table, there was still a warm imprint from his hand, as if symbolizing how easily a stranger's presence could warm a space filled with loneliness. Taking a sip of the now cool tea, Diana gazed at the faint rays of sunlight filtering through the window. Outside, the sky had cleared slightly. In the gray silence of the house, Diana felt the first hint of light. A light that both tempted and frightened her with the possibility of breaking free from old boundaries. Saturday evening found Diana in an unfamiliar state. She hadn't expected that Alex would come over and leave such a tangible trace in her thoughts. Usually she would watch TV with Mark, or already be preparing for bed, planning the next morning. But tonight, when her husband returned from his urgent work, there was an invisible wall between them. Mark entered the house around 8 in the evening, tiredly tossing his keys onto the side table and glancing around the living room. Diana noticed how his gaze lingered for a moment on the kitchen table, where the two now cold teacups still stood from her conversation with Alex. Of course, it was impossible to guess what had happened during the day, but Diana felt a tense string of anxiety inside her. "Have you had dinner?" Mark asked, somewhat absent-mindedly. "No, I waited for you," she lied, although she had no appetite. They sat down at the table. Mark reheated the leftovers from the previous day's pasta, and Diana silently pushed her fork around her plate. He asked about her day, and she began to talk about trivial things like cleaning and grocery shopping, but she deliberately omitted the fact that Alex had visited. Soon the conversation died down on its own. Mark seemed as tired as Diana was nervous. Eventually he suggested watching TV, and they moved to the couch. Diana watched as sports news flashed across the screen, but her mind was filled with other thoughts about how quickly everything could change if her conversations with Alex became known. And sometimes she caught herself thinking that earlier she found joy in caring for her loved one, but now she struggled to find satisfaction in it. She found comfort in Alex's words and the way he genuinely listened, which was something she hadn't felt in a long time, and this inner conflict tore her apart. As the clock approached 11 and Mark began to doze off to the droning of the sports broadcast, Diana's phone vibrated softly on the table. She picked it up and saw a message from Alex. "Sorry if it's too late. Just wanted to check if the cabinet door is still working okay." The simple, seemingly innocent message immediately resonated with her. She quickly typed a response. "Everything's fine. Thank you for fixing it, and thank you for being so kind to me today." She hesitated for a moment before hitting send, feeling that these words crossed a certain boundary, but she sent it anyway. The seconds of waiting felt excruciatingly long. The response came quickly. "I just did what seemed right. You not deserve more than just a thank you, dear. Have a good night." Reading these words, she felt a mix of admiration and shame. She wanted to type something more in response, to tell him how long it had been since she heard such words, to confess that his sympathy touched her deeply. But she simply closed the phone and looked around, almost expecting someone to catch her in the act. When she returned to the living room, she found Mark already asleep on the couch. The TV light illuminated his face, tired, slightly haggard from the past few weeks. Work, constant stress, rare conversations with his wife. It all seemed to have taken a toll on him, turning him into a kind but distant man. Diana looked at him intently, realizing that she couldn't remember the last time she had a heart-to-heart conversation with him or even held his hand. Watching her husband, she felt a wave of guilt. She hadn't tried to revive the closeness they once had. But at the same time, deep down, she felt a growing conviction that she wasn't the only one to blame. They both had allowed routine to consume their relationship. That night, lying in bed next to the peacefully sleeping Mark, Diana replayed Alex's words in her mind. "You deserve more." Different parts of her soul resonated with these words, yearning for the feeling of protection and interest that she had long forgotten. She tried to convince herself that this was all just a fleeting infatuation, that she could still turn back and avoid the risk. But her mind rebelled against her words, showing her all the paths this story could take. As the night wore on, Diana barely slept. When she looked out the bedroom window, she saw the faint pink streaks of dawn breaking over the houses. It seemed like the world was still asleep, but inside her, a silent storm had already begun. The next morning, Diana woke up earlier than everyone else, as usual. When she looked out the bedroom window, she saw the faint pink streaks of dawn breaking over the houses. It seemed like the world was still asleep, but inside her, a silent storm had already begun. She went downstairs to the kitchen and made herself some coffee, barely remembering how she had turned on the coffee maker. Every cell in her body was consumed by thoughts of what had been said and what had remained unspoken. As she sipped her coffee, she heard footsteps upstairs. Soon Callum entered the kitchen, tall in a baggy hoodie, his eyes still sleepy. He exuded that youthful energy that once pulsed within Diana herself. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled, yawning. "We have practice today." "Will you be back for dinner?" she asked, adding a bit of milk to her coffee. "Maybe not," he shrugged. "Planning to meet up with Alex? We want to grab a bite at the new diner." Alex? The name was familiar. He was one of those friends who was a bit older than the others. At the last party, he surprised Diana. Unlike Callum's rowdy friends, Alex quietly offered to help clean up, and his polite manner stood out. However, she didn't give it much thought at the time. "All right," she said with a distracted smile. "Let me know if your plans change." Callum nodded and, kissing her on the cheek, headed out the door, off for his morning run. Now the kitchen was almost silent. The faint ticking of the table clock and the soft breeze coming through the slightly open window were the only sounds. Diana sat at the table, her mind racing with thoughts of Alex, his words, his attentiveness. She remembered the moment by the garden bed when they talked about trivial things, and yet she felt that long-forgotten sensation of being seen and heard. She silently exhaled, trying to push away the thoughts that were consuming her. As she finished her coffee, she heard the sound of the front door opening and closing. Mark had left for work, and Callum had gone out with friends. The house was filled with an unfamiliar emptiness. Diana looked around the kitchen, her eyes lingering on the family photos on the fridge. She felt a pang of guilt as she thought about the secret she was keeping from her family. She knew that she couldn't keep living like this, pretending that everything was normal. She had to make a decision, no matter how difficult it was. She had to choose between her loyalty to her family and her own happiness. As she sat there lost in thought, she heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. She looked out the window and saw Alex getting out of his car, holding a bag of groceries. Her heart raced as she realized that he had come to see her again. She quickly got up from the table and went to open the front door. As she did, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She knew that she had to be honest with herself and with Alex, no matter what the consequences were. As she opened the door, she saw Alex standing there, a nervous smile on his face. "Hi," he said softly. "I hope it's okay that I stopped by." Diana nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "Of course," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Come in." As they stood in the entryway, Diana felt a mix of excitement and fear. She knew that she had to make a decision and that it wouldn't be easy. But she also knew that she couldn't keep living a lie, pretending that everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. She took a deep breath and looked at Alex, her eyes filled with determination. "We need to talk," she said softly. Alex nodded, his expression serious. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about this too. We can't keep pretending that nothing is happening between us. Diana felt a lump form in her throat as she realized the gravity of the situation. She knew that she had to be honest with herself and with Alex, no matter what the consequences were. I know, she said softly, and I'm scared, but I can't keep living like this, pretending that everything is okay when it's not. Alex reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. I know, he said, and I'm here for you, no matter what happens. We'll figure this out together. Diana felt a wave of relief wash over her as she realized that she wasn't alone in this. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but with Alex by her side, she felt like she could face anything. As they stood there, hand in hand, Diana felt a sense of peace wash over her. She knew that she had made the right decision, no matter what the future held, and with that knowledge, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Late evening descended on their quiet suburb. The warm air still held traces of the day's heat, but somewhere in the distance, a light drizzle began to fall. It seemed to fall randomly, sometimes pausing, then resuming with a rustle of leaves. Inside, Diana felt as if each drop echoed the turmoil within her. In the house, there was no one. Mark had gone out on an unexpected business meeting, and Callum was still out with friends, promising to return by midnight. For a long time, Diana had valued these rare windows of solitude when she could quietly take care of herself. But now her heart was filled with a sense of impending change, as if the very silence of the house was whispering, it's time to make a choice. Around 9 o'clock, her phone vibrated softly beside her. It was a message from Alex. I'm nearby. Stop by the shopping center for some errands. Can I drop by if you don't mind? I know it's late. Diana stared at the message for a long time, understanding how easy it would be to say no and avoid the risk. But her hand, as if on its own, typed, Come over. I'm alone. And her heart ached with a mix of fear, hope, and the thrill of the forbidden. 20 minutes later, a soft knock at the door announced his arrival. Diana opened it, trying to breathe steadily, but her fingers trembled slightly. Alex entered the hallway, shaking off the light raindrops from his hair. In the air, there was an immediate tense energy that neither of them could ignore any longer. Sorry to drop by so unexpectedly, he said softly, as if afraid to disturb the peace of the large house. It's okay, Diana replied, aware of how strongly his very presence drew her in. They moved to the kitchen, where the soft light from the lamp above the table cast a gentle glow. Alex sat across from her, close enough to talk quietly, but not so close that their knees touched. Between them, there was again that familiar sense of hidden intimacy. I've been thinking a lot about us, Alex said, running his hand along the edge of the table. I didn't want to pressure you, but it seems we're both on the edge of a precipice from which we either take a step forward or stop everything now. Hearing the words, step forward, Diana felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Yes, she understood that going further might mean no turning back, but she also realized that she could no longer live pretending that nothing was happening. She began, trying to find the right words. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation. I have a family, an adult son. I don't want to hurt anyone. Alex nodded, but there was a spark in his eyes that betrayed his resolve. I know, and I'm not asking you to throw it all away right now. But tell me, is there a future for us? Or should I walk away from your life? Diana shuddered at the directness of the question. The words walk away from your life cut deeply, as she had grown to cherish their conversations and the way he made her feel seen and heard. But logic and morality screamed that the right thing to do would be to end this before it went too far. For a moment, she closed her eyes, trying to shut out the whirlwind of thoughts. She remembered the dullness of her marriage, the feeling of loneliness in her own home, and the realization that she had been living for others for so long that she had forgotten about herself. When she opened her eyes again, she saw Alex looking at her with a mix of sympathy and quiet sadness. Alex, I'm sorry, she whispered. I don't know how to deal with this. It's too complicated. His gaze, filled with understanding and a hint of pain, only strengthened her realization that their attraction was mutual. But they both knew that acting on it now, in the quiet of her kitchen, would be too risky and too public. I understand, he said, leaning back slightly. I'm sorry if I rush things. They finished their tea in tense silence, exchanging only brief neutral phrases, as if trying to pretend that nothing significant had happened. But both of them knew that everything had changed. When they left the kitchen, Diana remembered the groceries in the hallway. Alex helped her carry the bags to the car, and as they stood there, the tension between them was palpable. Thanks for the company and the talk, Diana said, her voice slightly unsteady. I hope that we'll find a way out, Alex finished softly. I'm here if you need anything. Diana nodded, feeling a new wave of emotion wash over her. She got into the car and started the engine, trying to focus on the routine of driving. Alex stepped back, putting his hands in his pockets, and watched as she drove away. As Diana navigated the familiar streets, she felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. She knew that she was playing with fire, but she also knew that she couldn't ignore the feelings that Alex stirred within her. When she parked in front of her house, the sight of the familiar lawn and the quiet street filled her with a sense of both comfort and dread. Entering the house and closing the door behind her, Diana felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her. She knew that she couldn't keep living this way, torn between her loyalty to her family and her own desires. As she stood in the silent hallway, she took a deep breath and made a silent vow to herself to face whatever challenges lay ahead and make the difficult choices that she had been avoiding. The days that followed were filled with a mix of tension and anticipation. Diana found herself both dreading and longing for the moments when she would see Alex again. She knew that she was walking a fine line between happiness and heartache, but she also knew that she couldn't turn back now. As she went about her daily routine, she carried with her the knowledge that her life was about to change in ways she had never imagined. And as she looked out at the familiar sights of her neighborhood, she felt a sense of both excitement and fear at the thought of what the future held.